From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello and welcome to the McLaughlin Group. I'm Siraj Hashmi from the Washington Examiner, filling in for Tom Rogan again this week. I'm joined by our regular panelists, Pat Buchanan, syndicated columnist, Eleanor Clift, columnist with the Daily Beast, Clarence Page with the Chicago Tribune, and Republican consultant Matt Mackowiak. We're going to start off with issue 1, Russian Coax. President Trump is facing new questions about Russia. This time, it involves a bounty program in which a Russian military intelligence unit, the GRU, secretly offered Taliban-linked militants to kill U.S. and allied troops in Afghanistan. The White House has denied that Trump was ever briefed on the matter, and the president himself called it, quote, another Russian hoax, unquote. Meanwhile, Democrats and Republicans in Congress vow to get to the bottom of who knew what and when. Question, Pat. Based on what we know right now, is this a serious matter that can haunt President Trump?
I think it's potentially very serious in the sense that we don't know whether the money was paid, whether Americans were attacked, whether some of those Marines were killed by Taliban on the basis of the money they got from the GRU, the Russian GRU. So I think it really ought to be investigated. But there's no question about it, Siraj. This has fallen into the political vortex. And a lot of folks have real motivation to keep this going and to suggest that, Trump is doing something terrible. That would include the deep state. It would include the media that detests Trump, which is all over this story. It would include those who want to stay in Afghanistan and want a conflict with Russia. But I will say this, it is a serious matter. It ought to be looked into. What did the president know and when did he know it and what happened?
Eleanor.
Well, I don't think the White House can deflect their way out of this one. You've got a lot of Republicans who are very angry about this. There is enough evidence to show that there was at least an attempt that was made. There is a particular car bombing that killed 3 soldiers last year that looks like it was part of this hoax by the Russians. It's hardly a hoax. And the fact that the president treats it like a public relations problem that he can just whisk away. Lynn Cheney, a House member, highest ranking female member of the House Republican caucus and daughter of Dick Cheney, is asking a lot of very loud questions. And we are right back where we started with this president 3.5 years ago.
Clarence.
Yeah, this is very serious enough that I was surprised to see the White House jump forward saying that the president wasn't briefed on this. In this case, ignorance is not an excuse on a national security matter of this type of potential magnitude. And I say potential because the story isn't totally nailed down, but there's enough suspicion here for already a couple of major media have reported it. And it is also something that obviously Lynn Cheney, among others, is taking seriously. The reaction to this one, interestingly enough, compared to earlier controversies like the Ukraine gate and all, is that we see Republicans raising questions more quickly this time, it seems to me. I haven't taken a survey, but certainly there's we have a background here of a president whose story has changed in the past on previous controversies, and now his trust level, I think, is suffering.
Matt.
Yeah, it's a complicated story because there are some conflicting pieces of information and conflicting motivations here. First of all, to Eleanor's point about the president being briefed, it appears it may have been inserted into the president's daily brief at least once. That doesn't necessarily, mean that Trump read it. It also doesn't mean it was ever brought to him for a decision. So the fact that the intelligence agencies are saying he was not briefed on it could mean that they hadn't nailed it down enough, that he needed to be briefed, and that a decision needed to be made. Look, the timing of this is very suspicious, right? We're 4 months from the election. The president has announced to pull out from Afghanistan of American troops. That's very unpopular with a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill. And the other standard here that's at risk is the president's standard of going after anyone that kills an American troop overseas. You know, he did that against General Soleimani very effectively. And I would point out he did that against the objections of Democrats after the fact. So what would be interesting is if this is nailed down, you know, does he then exact some type of meaningful revenge on Russia? Could it be sanctions? Could it be something else? It's not that this administration has done nothing on Russia. The Defense Department has spent $7 billion countering Russia. They're trying to renegotiate the arms treaty. They've put sanctions on Russia. They've expelled diplomats. I think they've been tougher on Russia than Obama's been.
Yeah, let me put it in a little context. In February, I think it was 2018, U.S. fighter bombers slaughtered a group of rebels, so-called, who were moving on their position in eastern Syria. The Americans knew it was part of the Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries, slaughtered scores of them. Also, if you go back to Afghanistan, you'll recall I was in the Reagan White House. We were given those Stinger missiles, sent them into Afghanistan. They were shooting down Russian helicopters for years, and that's one of the factors that drove the Russians out. So there's a lot of people in the Russian government who got motivation. On the other hand, it seems to me this is an act of folly for Putin when the Americans are leaving Afghanistan, which he wants them to do.
Yeah, valiant attempt by everybody to muddy the waters and make this sound like this is just another event in a long string of dalliances with the Russians. This is bounty money from the Russians to kill American troops. This is an intelligence briefing that the president may have not have read. He doesn't read intelligence briefings. That's hardly a defense. And this is a president who has had multiple long conversations with President Putin in the intervening months, which again raises the question of what are the financial ties between Moscow and this president. And I am really looking forward to what the Supreme Court rules. I'm not saying that that the court is going to rule the way I want it, but there are still those tax returns out there that Trump doesn't want us to see and is working very hard for us not to see, that raise all kinds of questions about his financial arrangements with Vladimir Putin.
Clarence, really quick.
Get Robert Mueller to investigate that.
No, I just say that ignorance is no excuse for a president as far as those daily briefings are concerned. I mean, we remember the fuss over the 9/11, pre-9/11 daily briefing that said bin Laden determined to attack the United States, and we weren't ready to forgive that kind of oversight. Have we gotten so cynical about President Trump's attention span that we no longer expect him to even read the PDB? I wonder.
Matt, really quick, just as a question to follow up all of this, a lot of criticism about this particular story, about the timing of it, about the leaks. Is this just another intelligence matter that involves trying to, say, sabotage President Trump? And is the timing at all suspicious? This comes out 3 months after the initial report of President Trump allegedly being briefed in March amid the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I do think the timing is suspicious. And I agree with everyone. It's no excuse to say he didn't read the presidential daily briefing, or he didn't read that part of it, or didn't retain it, or didn't follow up on it. This is serious, right? And anytime an American soldier is targeted overseas by another foreign power like Russia, that's deadly serious. I would add, though, that the other thing to keep in mind here, and the intelligence community said that this week in their briefings on the Hill, is that by leaking the information about this bounty program, they have almost surely ended the ability for the intelligence community to investigate who in Russia from the GRU was part of it. So I think there's a real cost to there. If you really want to get down to the bottom of the bounty program, who's behind it, who's funding it, who was carrying it out, who got paid, that's going to be a lot harder to do now that this is out in the open, at least in terms of the open source reporting.
I think we know the answers. It's the GRU and it's the Russians. I don't think we need any more clarity on that issue.
And before we go to issue 2,
about the timing of the leaks, look at the information. This is now Donald Trump's intelligence community. He has appointed the heads of most of these agencies. I think this is not foreign agencies coming in to sabotage his presidency. And his act is really getting old, calling everything a hoax.
Well, to think that President Trump has a handle on the intelligence community, considering the fact that they essentially tried to wage war against him with this Mueller probe, I would say it's probably hardly his intelligence agency. But anyways, moving on to issue 2, Rona on the rise.
We got smart. New Yorkers stepped up. We wore masks. We socially distanced. We closed down. And we stopped the curve.
Despite being the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, New York has seen its lowest number of cases since March. However, other states aren't so lucky. Florida, California, Texas, and Arizona have seen a significant increase in cases and hospitalizations. While the rise can be attributed in part to the reopening of the economy, analysis by the Los Angeles Times found that the California surge began around Memorial Day weekend, the same week that nationwide protests in the wake of George Floyd's death commenced. Eleanor, do you believe that this is the final coronavirus wave?
The final coronavirus wave? No, the coronavirus is going to have the last word. And the last week of information has been absolutely terrifying. You had Robert Redfield, who heads the CDC, use the word apocalyptic if the states, the biggest states in the country, Texas, Florida, also Arizona, if they aren't able to get a handle on this, on the corona cases in their states. There are more cases of coronavirus in Florida than there were in Italy. This is because, as we all predicted, the opening up too soon and without regard to wearing masks. I'm pleased that Vice President Pence, Senate Leader McConnell, Dick Cheney even sent out a picture of himself with a mask. Real men wear masks.
Clarence?
Well, I can endorse what Eleanor just said. Around the world, we see industrialized nations that have been sticking to the proper schedule. They've flattened the curve. They're on the way to reopening and recovery, and already starting it. Whereas we've kind of become a patchwork of state by state early reopenings versus more cautious states, and you can see the impact of these premature reopenings. And it's a darn shame that our country is the one that's really falling behind now on recovering from corona, largely because of political reasons. Who else says, masks are a sign that you belong to one party and no mask means you belong to somebody else? It's confusing the public, which is the last thing you want to do in the middle of a pandemic.
Matt?
Well, sure. These mini outbreaks that we're seeing in specific states in the southern half of the country are concerning. If you look inside the numbers, there is some reason for hope. What you're seeing is that you're seeing milder strains of coronavirus across the country. The death rate is down. The positive case rate is going up. But so we know that there are milder cases. We know that the average age of the person who's contracting the virus in recent weeks has gone down, which tends to lead you to believe that this is younger people congregating in public, in bars, in large gatherings. So we really do have to message to the 35 and under crowd that while they may not die from coronavirus, they may contract it and give it to someone else who may die from it. So the challenge now is that the economy is not going to get shut down again. It's just people are not going to do it. This is not about government. It's about persuading the public to voluntarily take these steps, to socially distance, to try to stay at home as much as possible, to wear masks in public, to wash their hands.
To me, this is the tail end of the initial wave, and it is very disheartening, and it is sort of debilitating psychologically because we were doing so well. Actually, in terms of deaths, I've been following it day by day in that Washington Post, and they do a good job on it. And the number of deaths in April were up to 2,000 a day and above, spiking above, but now they're down to 500 a day in the United States. Before this thing took off in Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, could almost not find 4 larger states. People are going out, they're going to the beach, they're marching, they're protesting, people on the left and on the right. And I do believe, I'm not an optimist about where this is going.
Yeah, there's been a lot of armchair quarterbacking in the last couple of weeks, particularly with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who early on didn't promote the use of wearing face masks because they're trying to reserve all of these personal protective equipment for hospitals and healthcare workers. And unfortunately, we'll always have to look at the federal government's response to this. But anyways, moving on to issue 3, Confeder-Late than never.
Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves, a Republican, signed a bill Tuesday to remove the Confederate emblem from the official state flag. It was the last remaining state to feature Confederate insignia. Despite opposition in the past, the Republican-controlled state legislature overwhelmingly passed the measure to replace the flag, which had flown for 126 years.
Clarence, question to you. Why do you think it's taken so long for a lot of these Confederate symbols and monuments to finally come down?
Well, as an old school Virginian once told me, Civil War didn't end in 1865. That was just intermission. And I think that I've been seeing that more and more lately, ever since this new racial reckoning, if you will. And by the way, I trace this flag controversy right back to the tragedy of George Floyd back in Minnesota, which is about as far from the South as you can get and still stay in the 48 states. But this is certainly part of the national awareness now of our really, I'll call it confusion about race. We have been, on the one hand, hoping things were better than they really are, and then realizing, no, we got a lot of work to do still in resolving these old arguments. And that has led, a surprise to me, but this has led now to a reexamination of all of these Confederate relics that we have around and that ongoing debate. So when it's even reached Mississippi, that tells me that indeed change has come in the country, cultural change has come, and we're not resolving these things the way we used to.
Matt.
Yeah, this is striking. I mean, Mississippi has been sort of the lone holdout from a state flag standpoint. Your state flag should be about your heritage, but it should be about your values. And the fact that it would, make such a large percentage of the population feel uncomfortable means this is an entirely appropriate step. You have the Republican governor, Tate Reeves, who's now agreed to sign a bill to change the state flag. I think this was really kind of pushed forward, not just because of the moment we're living through, but also because the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, said they were no longer going to allow championship events, conference events to be held in the state of Mississippi. That was following an announcement made, I think, in recent years by the NCAA as well. So this did become a financial issue for Mississippi State and Ole Miss as much as it did for the state in terms of the state's image. Mississippi has a very large African-American population, but so do a lot of these southern states. And so the one problem I have a little bit with some of the statues, there's two problems really. One is the process, right? If the city council or the mayor are voting to do that and they have public input, that's one thing, and that's perfectly appropriate. If a crowd of people are using ropes to pull down a statue, that's vandalism. That's criminal vandalism. That is not an appropriate way to take a statue down in a democracy like ours. The second problem I have with this is we are applying today's standards to yesterday's men. And I just think that we have to be a little bit careful about that. What's not appropriate today would have been appropriate perhaps back then. And there were different attitudes at that time. And so I don't think we want to whitewash history. I think the standard should be, are we honoring people who did things that we're not proud of today and that send the wrong signal to people? And in that case, taking the Confederate symbol off the Mississippi flag or appropriately taking down some of these statues, I think is the right thing to do.
Pat.
Well, let me speak of this from a standpoint of self-interest. And my ancestors were from Mississippi, Oklahoma, Mississippi. One of my ancestors voted for secession and he died at Vicksburg. Another was captured at Atlanta. These are my father's family by General Sherman's troop and spent the rest of the war in Camp Douglas, which Clarence is familiar with in Illinois. Why do people stand by these symbols? Because we don't believe the battle flag stands for slavery. We believe it stands for bravery, defiance, folks who'd said they were going to leave the Union the way our grandfathers left the British Empire. They honor the people that fought and died in the cause. They don't mean when it's over, it's a great thing that slavery was eliminated because of the war. But does anybody really think that those of us who honored and loved the battle flag really do it because we want to insult African Americans who are our fellow citizens? That's an utter falsehood. I understand why Mississippi stood as long as it did. And those are good people down there. And the people that praise General Lee, he's been a hero up at West Point. He still is. Is that because they think he's in favor of slavery or was indeed in favor of slavery? There are arguments on this side as well. And let me say this, Siraj. The establishment is on the run on both sides. Boston has taken down a statue of Abraham Lincoln, which portrays him as the emancipator with an American slave, African slave, and he's got his manacles still on and the shackles have been broken. And DC is trying to do the same thing. Up at Princeton University, they took Woodrow Wilson's name off the Public Policy Institute. Now, I've never been a fan of Woodrow Wilson, but that's outrageous. He's an historic figure. He's an enormous figure at Princeton. I mean, and okay, he was a segregationist.
Real quick to get Eleanor in here.
Okay, well, in terms of Woodrow Wilson, they took his name off the public policy school because they don't feel the students there are not comfortable with the message he sends. It's been debated. It was rejected to take his name off a couple of years ago. It's a private institution. They have made their decision. They did it the right way, and I think that's appropriate. As far as the Lincoln statue in Washington, D.C. was a huge event when it was erected, and 25,000 mostly Black people attended. Frederick Douglass spoke and gave a very moving speech, but he also said Abraham Lincoln is the white man's president. And that statue with the subservient-looking slave thanking the master does seem insulting to people today. Build another statue next to it, or put that statue in the museum. You have to respect the people today. The revolutionary heroes lost the war. They can be considered, that was treasonous behavior.
We could spend the whole show talking about this, and I wish we did. But I just want to very quickly publicly thank Pat for telling me about Camp Douglas. Even though I'm from Chicago, I didn't hear about it. It's not taught in our schools. It should be. And it was the worst atrocity of the war, actually, but you don't hear about it because, like I say, history belongs to the winners. But we have a situation in which I don't want to see the statues just torn down. I want to see them preserved in a museum or wherever, because this is our history. And we Americans don't know our history. And it's important for white Southerners to know how Black Southerners feel about the General Lee and the rest who, let's face it, fought for the preservation of slavery. And that is a moral position. There were people against slavery then, some guy named Abraham Lincoln, as I recall. Anyway, we'll go into that.
Well, thank you, Clarence. I mean, just to echo that point, I mean, even on history with things that were outside of slavery, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, that was something I only learned within the last few months. That's not something that's widely taught. And we're only hearing about it now because we're approaching the 100th anniversary. And it's sad, it's unfortunate, but that's just how bad things have gotten when it comes to history. Anyways, moving on to predictions. Pat.
My prediction is that Joe Biden, the cellar dweller, now that he's coming out into the open, the left will not be satisfied with his position, which is basically, we're going to study the issue of reparations. I think because the policing thing, reform, is not going anywhere really, that we're going to move very fast to reparations as a national issue, and Biden will eventually come out in the campaign for reparations for slavery.
Eleanor?
Pat, always on the hunt for the culture issue that will swing the election.
Everybody is this day.
My prediction is there's going to be a showdown over the Confederate names because enough members of Congress, and Elizabeth Warren has an amendment in the Defense Appropriations Bill to rename the military bases that bear the names of Confederate generals. I think you get a majority vote for that in the Congress. The president said he's going to veto it. Let's see if that happens. I think he could be overridden.
Clarence.
culture war issue.
Before I say anything else, before I get a big pile of emails from viewers who do argue about the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln wasn't against slavery so much as he was in favor of preserving the Union. So I want to point that out, and children, we'll have a quiz on that next week. But anyhow, my prediction is that Eleanor Holmes Norton is introducing a measure in Congress to move the statue that Pat was talking about. Well, actually, the original is in Washington. It was a duplicate in Boston that was desecrated here recently. But I think this measure is going to go through. They're going to, Eleanor Holmes Norton wants to move the statue rather than destroy it. And I think that that's going to be the winning position. It'll just be an argument over where they're going to move it to.
Matt?
As we come back from the July 4th recess, watch for Congress to cut a bipartisan deal for another recovery bill. Likely will have narrow liability for businesses that reopen from being sued over coronavirus risk. Limited aid to states, not related to bailout pensions, but related to lost income. And perhaps an extension of the unemployment program, although not as generous as it was last time.
And I predict that with this new national security law, it being implemented on July 1st in Hong Kong by the Chinese Communist Party, the Trump administration is going to threaten sanctions, possibly even implement it, but I doubt that they will pull away from trade talks, considering that they're trying to reach a phase 2 agreement. That's all for the McLaughlin Group this week. Tom will be back. Thanks for watching.